Burlington, Rick Goldring.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our session on international trade agreements and municipal government. I'm Rick Goldring, the Mayor of the City of Burlington. I'm also the chair of AMO's Large Urban Caucus. And I have the privilege today of introducing the session speaker, and I'll be back following the presentation to moderate a question and answer session in the time remaining. So our presenter today is Patrick Leblond. Patrick is Associate Professor and holder of the C.N. Paul M. Tellier Chair on Business and Public Policy at the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. He is also a Senior Fellow with the Global Economy Program at the Centre for Global Governance and Innovation in Waterloo. He is an expert in global economic governance and international political economy, regional economic integration, financial regulation, and business and public policy. At the Center of Global Governance and Innovation, Patrick specializes in the investigation of international trade in the areas of Canada, European Union, Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Prior to his current professorship, Patrick held academic and administrative posts at HEC Montreal and La Université de Montréal. Patrick also holds the designation of Chartered Accountant, and before his career in academia, he had a very distinguished career in the private sector. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Patrick Leblond.
Good afternoon. Thank you for AMO for the invitation. It's always a little bit daunting when you come to speak after politicians and people who are used to this kind of public speaking, and you're asked to talk about international trade agreements and what they mean for municipalities. So I hope you will bear with me. I've tried to make this as exciting as it can be, but international trade, unless you're talking about Mr. Trump, is not always, can be a little bit dry. But hopefully I will spark your interest and especially trigger questions that you might have for the Q&A session afterwards. So I want to start with this question, which many of you think, like, what is he going to talk about? Yes, international trade is important. It creates jobs. Sometimes it takes away jobs because of extra competition. But generally, economists who have studied this say, it's free trade and international trade is good. And certainly in a relatively small country, small economy like Canada, it's very positive. And also it can lead to additional investments. And for many of you in your communities, I'm sure you have a lot of companies that export for where international markets are important. And also you have foreign companies who come and invest, whether it's to exploit resources or labor talent or just good infrastructure that can be available. So that's not what I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to try to sell you the pros and cons of international trade. I think you know them fairly well. But I want to talk about trade agreements, and in a way this is what I was asked about, and how they relate to municipalities and municipal governments. But before I do that, I just want to show you a few graphs. Don't get scared. This is not an international trade lecture. I want to make one point that sometimes, especially in the media, tends to be forgotten. And it's that nowadays, both exports and imports matter, right? We live in a world where I'm sure you've heard the term global value chains or regional value chains, where companies, for a company's competitiveness, it can be as important not only to have access to a foreign market, but also to have access to foreign inputs that can be cheaper, that can be of better quality, that, again, will make that company not only more competitive within the Canadian market, but also internationally. And this is something that if you hear Mr. Trump speak and others, that's not the reality that he is presenting. The reality that he is presenting is the one that exports are good, imports are bad, right? So exports create jobs, imports destroy jobs. But that's not the reality, and we are seeing it right now with the trade war, the tariff war, where a lot of companies that, like in the auto sector, which is a big sector for Ontario, you need steel, you need aluminum, you need these parts, and a lot of trade takes place not only within North America, but with the rest of the world. And when you start imposing tariffs, well, it increases costs for a variety of goods, and therefore, ultimately, the consumer has to pay, right? I was just, before coming here, I was reading an article where now, because of the tariffs on aluminum, even dog tags are going up. So, here's one for municipalities. So this is what we mean, and in this chart, it just shows you that in fact the top industries in terms of trade for Ontario tend to be the same on both the export and the import side, right? So in a way that's not surprising, because that's the kind of world we live in, where companies don't do it all. They specialize in certain things, they aggregate things together, and then they buy and sell to other companies and deal with smaller suppliers. So I won't necessarily go through the presentation and the graphs. Certainly, as you can see up there, we're talking about, it's the automotive manufacturing, of course, is the largest trading industry in Ontario, and that's certainly not a surprise. So where do our exports, when we talk about Ontario, where do they go? Well, not surprisingly, they go to the United States, the large majority of them, with the European Union and China and Mexico and Japan coming later. You might wonder, why is Saudi Arabia there? You might have heard of the lavs that we're selling them. Very controversial, of course, here in Ottawa. But that's that contract that is now made Saudi Arabia one of the more important top 10 markets for Ontario. But I don't think that necessarily will last for a long time. And Hong Kong, of course, is just a gateway in and out of China. In terms of import, the same thing, the US, China, the EU, Mexico, Japan, and then South Korea, Switzerland. So these are, in a way, the countries, the economies that matter for the Ontario economy when we talk about trade. And the reason why I'm presenting this is because it impacts which trade agreements people involved at the municipal level should care about or should wonder. Is like, okay, well, are there trade agreements that cover trade with these countries? And for all these countries, Canada now has or will soon acquire a so-called free trade agreement. Although I'll talk about the free notion in just a minute. But basically, for all these countries, Canada will have trade agreements that will cover not only trade, but also investments with companies coming from those countries. So quickly, there's of course NAFTA that has been in the media now for over a year. We've, hot and cold, right? We hear announcements that a deal is close, now not clear, Canada's shut out, trilateral talks might come back, who knows? And I'm happy to take questions in the Q&A about NAFTA, which is something I've followed very quickly. Last year, the EU-Canada Comprehensive and Economic Trade Agreement came into force in September 27, 2017. You might have heard that it has a provisional application. That only means that 5% of it is not applicable because the EU member state parliaments have not ratified the agreement, but otherwise it's actually in force. And already we're starting to see some of the benefits of that agreement with the removal of tariffs. EFTA, well, this is another free trade agreement that Canada signed with the European Free Trade Area, so Norway, Liechtenstein, Iceland, and Switzerland. And we saw earlier that Switzerland was one of the countries that Ontario companies are importing from. And in part, that relates to the pharmaceutical industry, for instance. Canada has an agreement now with Korea. We saw that was another country where imports are important. Also, I would presume in the automobile sector. Automotive is part of that. And the CPTPP, now the Comprehensive Progressive Agreement on Trans-Pacific Partnership, which hopefully will enter in force sometime in 2019. We're told that Canada will ratify the agreement and pass the necessary implementation legislation soon. And once enough countries have ratified the agreement, then it will come into force. And that includes Japan, it includes Vietnam. So certainly important countries for Ontario, also Mexico, which creates interesting dynamics when it comes to NAFTA. And I'm not sure, if you ask me, I'm not clear what they are, but they are there. And then finally, the World Trade Organization, of course, which covers trade for over 150 countries, which also bounds how things happen in the Ontario economy. So what is the logic of trade agreements? People think, oh, well, free trade, that's easy. You just remove barriers, and that's the end of it. Well, if that were the case, as a few prominent economists said, free trade agreements should be one line. Everything's free. That's it. You can ship, you can import, export, whatever. No rules, no tariffs, nothing. The reality is not. If you look at the Canada-EU agreement, you look at the CPTPP, these are agreements, even NAFTA, that go in the thousands of pages. And why do they go in the thousands of pages is because you have long lists of what's allowed, what's not allowed, here's the exception. Sometimes you even have to read the footnotes to really understand what applies, what doesn't apply. So yes, technically it covers economic flows of goods, services, investment, data nowadays with digital trade and more government services being on the cloud. And that affects government, but certainly it also affects how companies operate. In terms of principles, obviously the idea is that there should be non-discrimination, national treatment, everyone should be treated equal. And fairness, right? There should be non-unfair practices vis-a-vis firms of one country versus another. These are the underlying principles. But at the end of the day, we're talking about exceptions. Often that's why the agreements are so long, so technical, so complicated, because you have a so-called sort of negative list, which means, well, anything goes except. And then you have positive list, nothing goes except. And finally, thresholds, right? And we'll come back to that. But for instance, when we talk about government procurement, agreements like the CETA with the European Union, the agreement with the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement also has thresholds when it comes to government procurement. And that means, well, anything above the threshold applies, anything below the threshold doesn't apply. So it makes these agreements very complicated, and more they delve into provincial and municipal realities. Before that, free trade agreements were fairly easy. You just, it was all focused on on border issues. It was all focused on trade in goods and basically removing tariffs or lowering tariffs. But that's just nowadays a small portion of free trade agreements. Now we're talking about beyond the border obstacles, right? Regulation, procurement, investment, subsidies, all these kinds of things that matter, that affect, in a way, your everyday life. And so in that sense, it's become much more complicated, and you have the federal government that negotiates these agreements, signs them, ratifies them, but then requires provincial and municipal governments to abide by the rules. So there is an issue there also when it comes to the negotiations. We certainly, in the context of the agreement with the European Union, the provinces were involved quite closely in the negotiations, but that was the only time it was done. Were provinces, municipalities consulted really when it came to negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership? Not so much. Yes, there was consultations, but not necessarily being deeply involved in the negotiations. So if we look at municipal policies or municipal government policies and international trade agreements, And I took this from the Government of Canada's website because I thought they do a relatively good job of kind of outlining the issues, and I thought I would do the same for you, although I won't go into all the technicalities. I'll refer you to trade lawyers for that. But at least give you a sense of how it might impact municipal governments, right? So you have financial assistance, like as an example, tax breaks that might be given to companies, procurement, which I've mentioned, P3s, so public-private partnerships, and also regulation, which might have something to do with the environment, for instance, or water sanitation, or these kinds of things. So if we take them separately in the little time that I have, so Canada has signed on to agreements at the World Trade Organizations, for instance, that in a way prevents subsidies from being offered to companies in a discriminatory manner to attract investment that would give them a competitive advantage vis-a-vis other companies, right? And often, of course, it's directed towards local or national companies against foreign companies. And of course, we hear about the Bombardiers and these kinds of fights and trade fights taking on because of subsidies, but it can apply very much at the municipal level. When sometimes you want to retain or you want to attract industries or specific companies, and you might say, okay, well, we'll put together a tax break program, or specifically for a particular company. I mean, we've seen this, for instance, for at a much bigger level, but Amazon's second headquarter, right? We've seen here in Ontario, Toronto was one of the bidders. You had Montreal, in Quebec, you had Vancouver, and then, of course, in the United States, and then what kind of packages were put together. And then the big question is, well, are these packages and the incentives that are being offered respectful of Canada's international engagements? And then, could other companies come and challenge these? And ultimately, this could lead to some kind of dispute. So that's something that certainly very much relates to the municipal world, where, if you're giving some kind of incentives, could it be a subsidy? In other agreements, there are also issues about investments and subsidies, or even when it comes to services that a municipal government might acquire. But then the question is, well, are there exceptions for municipal governments in that particular agreement? So, for instance, NAFTA has exceptions for municipal governments. But then, that's the problem. You have to go see basically, okay, where is the company coming from? Is it coming from a country with which we have an agreement? Then what does that agreement say? So it can be actually very, very complicated. Unfortunately. So in a way, the Government of Canada is not making it easier for you. The same applies to procurement. Before the Canada-EU Comprehensive and Economic Trade Agreement, public procurement at the provincial and municipal level was not an issue, right? But I guess because the provinces were part of the negotiations, and on the insistence of the European Union, in a way, in terms of reciprocity, the EU was saying, well, we're going to give you access to our public procurement markets, basically from the local level to all the supranational level. Well, what about you, Canada? We want to have access to your markets. And that was a major part of negotiations. Certainly a lot of municipalities were concerned about what that meant and their ability to do economic development. Ultimately, thresholds were agreed to that would allow basically municipal governments to discriminate against EU-based companies in tenders. But above that threshold, you're not supposed to. And then if you do, potentially, that's still a big question, what happens, right? Certainly a company could complain, they could then, dispute could be issued towards the federal government, that would then get, speak to the provincial government, who would then speak to the municipal government. But then how the matter gets resolved is not entirely clear to me, but certainly there is an issue there when it comes to procurement above certain thresholds. Public-private partnerships are a little bit the same way. Right? In some cases, is there a subsidy being provided? Or if it's a kind of service contract, which is akin to procurement, Well, in that case, as there was their discrimination in favor of an Ontario company or a local company as opposed to a foreign company coming from a country with which we have an agreement, right? So again, depending on the shape of the P3 taking place, there could be issues there and contravention of an agreement's provisions. And finally, again, regulation could be an issue, right? All sorts of regulations sometimes are they deemed to favor, again, a local company vis-a-vis a potential competitor coming from abroad. And then could that competitor say, wait a minute, you've adopted that rule is actually good for the local company, but not for us. One example, if we talk about data, is the whole notion of data localization or data residency, right? So if as a municipal government, you say, okay, we want cloud services, right? To put all our data on the cloud, we need a cloud service provider. Well, where is that cloud service provider from? Where are the servers based? Then there's the issue, of course, of making sure it's secure, making sure it's private. But what happens if there's a bid and the competitor, one of the bidding companies, is from abroad and has its servers abroad, right? And you say, well, no, the servers have to be, in Canada, because in a way it follows federal regulations and also in many instances provincial regulations. So, but that foreign company says, well, this is discrimination. There's an agreement here. For instance, CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, has a whole chapter on data flows and e-commerce, and they challenge the data localization. They say, no, this is discriminatory. And in fact, the agreement is not clear whether there's an exception for municipal governments or, in some cases, agencies or things like that. It's still, at least from what the questions I've been asking, not entirely clear whether the sort of government exception goes down all the way to municipalities in that particular example. So, this is just one example of regulation that could be seen as discriminatory. So I just wanted to give you a portrait of how Canada's international trade agreements could affect your everyday life, in a way, at the municipal level. It's not something that we hear talk about a lot. It's not something that we think a lot. But certainly, more and more, these agreements, affect what happens at the local level, and certainly can affect some of the decisions that are taken at that level. So I thank you very much. I look forward to your questions. And if you want to talk about NAFTA and the politics of it or whatsoever, I'm more than happy to do so. If you have very specific questions about exceptions in a particular agreement, I would say maybe we can talk separately. Because otherwise I think I'll just bore people to death. And in many cases, I wouldn't even know what the exact agreements are. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Are there any questions? The microphones are operational. Just jump right up and state your name, where you're from, and your question.
Hi, thank you. Debbie Lynch, Councillor, Township of Asphodel, Norwood. I would just like to ask how the whole concept with supply management in terms of dairy and chicken, for instance, how that fits into this.
Great question. Right now, for agriculture, in NAFTA, in CETA with the European Union, so that you have exceptions. And supply management is one of them, where our partners have recognized that we have this system. In the context of CETA with the European Union, as you've probably heard, we have allowed what are called tariff rate quotas, which are basically quotas that allow, in this case, the European Union to export dairy products, in this case, to Canada. And so, I forget, it's 30,000 tons or something. And of course, Canada allocates the quotas to various quota holders, so either producers or retailers, so on and so forth, and then they are free to go and buy, and if they don't use the quotas, they lose them, right? Same thing with the CPTPP. So again, there are provisions in there, somewhat lower, but giving access to foreign producers. And in this case, this was one of the demands by the Australians and especially the New Zealanders and the Americans also. And of course, now we see President Trump coming back to us. Now, what's going to happen if we get a new NAFTA? It's not clear. Let's say if you're asking me my expectation, I don't think that this government or any federal government wants to dismantle supply management, but I would not be surprised that we would see more of these kinds of breaches that we've seen. And in fact, Canada already gave the Americans the breach when the United States were part of TPP. Now, Mr. Trump pulled out, but so we might ultimately give him back what we already had agreed to give to the Americans within the context of TPP. But we'll see, in a way, what do we get in return? That's the big question. So that's how it fits. It's just one more of these exceptions that the federal government, when it negotiates, and of course through the consultations, it says, okay, that we're not touching. Or yes, but only in this way. Right? So ultimately, these are agreements, free trade agreements people say they're not free trade agreements. They're managed trade agreements. And ultimately, you might say they're about exceptions, ultimately. I don't know if that answers your question.
We'll go to microphone number 3, please.
Christine Drimmy, staff in the region of Durham. Did I understand you correctly when you were saying that some of the data exceptions were being applied to municipalities because they weren't considered to be an order of government? Is that what you were saying?
It's one of the question marks that I have, and I haven't received a clear answer yet. So from at least the trade lawyers that I've spoken to, this is a whole new area, right? But until now, no trade agreement that Canada signed has dealt with data flows across the border, right? So there's nothing in NAFTA, because NAFTA was negotiated even before. Now it's clear there's going to be a chapter if we get a new agreement within NAFTA. Most people assume that the language in that chapter will be similar to the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that Canada signed on to. So the CPTPP now is the only agreement that has a chapter on e-commerce and data flows. And the way it's phrased, it says, for business, no restrictions. For government, exceptions are allowed, right? Except that the way they don't use the term government, they use the term parties. And I asked someone, I said, well, does party in the Canadian context mean, from the federal government all the way to municipal governments, hospitals, universities? And they say, well, unless it's specified, no, right? So the provinces have clearly said where they stand in many cases on these data flows, and especially when it comes to privacy, where they allow this, they require this. But let's say it's a question mark that I have. If someone challenged it, is it covered in there? And I'm still waiting for the answer. So if anyone knows, I'd be happy to hear this. But when I was reading this and looking into this, it wasn't clear to me. Because, of course, at the federal level, it's very clear. Data, government data, or any service has to be kept within Canada. A lot of provinces have the same kind of requirements. But then some people say, okay, well, but is that going to apply, especially when we're talking about, in this case, outside of government, especially where it's been clearly stipulated where it applies and where it does apply. So it's one of the question marks that I have.
Microphone number 2.
David Newman, Councillor, City of Brantford. You did an excellent job of describing the free trade agreements and telling municipalities to remain alert to the regulations so we don't run afoul of them. My question is anyone researching what the opportunities are for municipalities with these trade agreements?
That's a good question. I think generally, and I don't know if, I wouldn't say there's no one, although what I can say is that generally, of course, the focus has been very much at a national level, right? And now there's starting to be interest, especially because of these new agreements, like the one that we signed with the European Union and now with the CPTPP, that go much beyond traditional agreements, are saying, well, this matters for provincial municipal governments, and we're at the stage where, how does it matter, right? But on the benefit side, I think we're still back at the idea that, well, these agreements generally are supposed to increase trade or trade opportunities, create more investment opportunities, and ultimately, it's supposed to be good, both at the national level and of course at the local level. Because if a foreign company comes and they say, oh, you have these trade agreements, I want to take part of that, I can export back to my country or I can export to the US, I'll invest in your community, right? So that's how the logic works. But I can't say that I've seen specific studies that look as to, which communities and how have they benefited from these agreements. I don't know if the data is available at that fine-grained level, but it certainly would be interesting. That's probably what you would like to know, ultimately. But I can't say that I've seen something, at that granular level, to where you can make the clear link that it's because of that trade agreement.
Perhaps some enterprising consultants will discover this and approach municipalities.
Maybe.
Over to microphone number 3, please.
Lynn Gregory from McDougall, councillor. The question involves your 3P funding, cooperation. Sometime in the past, it was involved with healthcare and the building of hospitals. Is there regulation about this at this time, or it seems to have fallen out of favor?
Well, again, my understanding of how these trade agreements can relate to public-private partnerships. I mean, often I would say healthcare, again, the federal government, from what I've seen, I haven't looked in the details of all the agreements. As I said, they're very long and very complicated. It seems that there is an exception for often negotiated, like in NAFTA, for healthcare services. And CETA, the same thing. Healthcare is one of those areas that, for procurement rules, for instance, is left aside. So in that case, and then you have also in terms of construction. So if you're building a hospital, there are exceptions there where the procurement rules within CETA with the European Union don't apply. So it's often, I would say, generally, those exceptions apply, but you really almost, I guess one of the messages here is that you have to go case by case and see, okay, does this apply or not apply? Which context, which countries are, those companies are they coming for? Which agreement applies? And then you have to go and try to find out, okay, what are the exceptions? And it's, just going through the federal government's website, I must say it was not very clear. I felt, okay, I should ask a trade lawyer. So.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So we have a few more minutes left. I have one question that was given to me to fill in some time here. 20 years ago, the world seemed remarkably different. Markets were opening to trade. Democratic elections were the goal of many countries, and individual freedom and wealth was the goal. The objectives haven't changed, but what happened to the consensus that free trade, democratic elections, and personal freedoms all go hand in hand?
Right. That's like the multi-trillion-dollar question. It's a tough one. We're still trying to figure out exactly what happened. Certainly, we're seeing in some countries a move towards less democracy. In part, it seems to be related to globalization and freer trade and concerns about what's happened. And I think some of these concerns, or many of these concerns, are legitimate. There are communities, there are companies that have suffered as a result of free trade and free trade agreements. We should not kid ourselves to think that all is hunky-dory and we should just go ahead and sign these agreements. And in a way, the exceptions that are there tend to prove that point. They are there exactly for that purpose, to try to protect certain sectors or certain communities or areas. But at the same time, it's also created other opportunities. But it's the imbalance, right? And at the same time as this has happened, of course, governments have been cutting down on welfare programs, support for workers who might lose, or communities that might lose important businesses or might lose their jobs, and then people leaving those communities. So how do we deal with this? And governments have not necessarily been very good at that, and in the United States, very clearly, the programs that have put in place to deal with sort of these adjustments, these trade adjustments, have not been very good. And some people say, well, this is in part the resentment that we see in the context of the United States, but even in Europe in some cases. But it's hard to say what is it exactly. Is it just a resurfacing of nationalism, and it's in fact more a concern vis-a-vis immigration in some cases, in other cases really the feeling that that politicians sometimes push that we'd be better if we were on our own, where the reality tends to show that that would not be the case. So it's a tough one, but yes, let's say there was much more of a consensus, even though critics were already expressing the same concerns. But now it seems that some people have decided to use this as kind of a wedge issue to try to gain, in a way, politically, unfortunately. But I would say, generally in Canada, there's still a strong consensus in favor of trade. We recognize, and in other countries that depend economically on trade, no one says we should close the border because we know that we would suffer as a result. And that's the message that most people are trying to bring to President Trump, but unfortunately, he's not really listening. And we can question whether he's capable of listening, but that's a different story.
But we know we're going to be listening to microphone number 3.
Well, thank you. My name's Steve Arnold. I'm the mayor of St. Clair Township. And so it's wonderful to come to these sessions, but I'm so confused. I had...
I'm sorry, I thought I would help, but...
In the springtime, early on, we had our treasurer come with all these agreements and stuff that we had to sign off on bylaws because of all the trade agreements. That we have to have everything, it's got to be electronic, and we have to have it open bidding for anyone throughout the world to come and bid on all the stuff we're going to do. Now I'm listening that there's exceptions. Now I'm trying to understand whether what we did was right. And I'm totally lost right now. Because I think we got a pretty sharp council and people are on top of stuff pretty good, but when our treasurer told that to us, that because of trade agreements we had to have all these bylaws in place, so we went ahead and did them, now it sounds like I didn't necessarily have to do that.
Well, I mean, it's hard to talk about the specifics, but of course, if you were told to sign these bylaws that basically said anything goes, and for any procurement bid, you have to treat all foreign companies the same, then I would say you were very badly advised by whoever came and told you had to do that, because that's not the reality, right? So where is the company from, that's bidding? Is it from a country with which we have an agreement, right? And then looking at that agreement, is it a country where, for instance, an agreement where public procurement is a part of it, right? Right now, there's no such thing in NAFTA. Yes, we signed some kind of agreement with the Americans, which now they're about to repeal, but that was, as far as I understand it, only for the provincial level, not for the municipal level, right? So in CETA, it touches on the municipal level, but there are exceptions, right? So health is one of them, because that was, of course, a big concern in Canada at the time. So you really have to, if someone says, it has to be a blanket bylaw, I would say, well, maybe you want to revisit that, because every agreement has its own exceptions and thresholds and everything, and it's going to be the same with the CPTPP that's coming, right? Maybe it's the easier approach, right? Just open up to everyone and treat them equally. But if for your concern is say, well, wait a minute, I want to make sure that, yes, I want to be compliant, but am I too compliant?
Sir.
Hi, Adam Thompson, City of London. Thank you for the presentation, Patrick. It was really, really informative. Most of the information you've talked about today has been sort of looking at trade from a municipal level as policy takers. I'm interested in your take on the role that municipalities could potentially have as policy makers or pushing more aggressive trade actions.
Well, thank you for your question. I guess I see it in two ways. I see your question more is it one part of the question in terms of what can municipal governments do to create more trade opportunities or investment, or is it what role can you take in order to inform negotiations, for instance, when the federal government, okay, so it's the latter. Well, certainly, I think whenever there is a negotiation taking place, the way our system works is that the federal government is legally, constitutionally responsible for negotiating disagreements, signing them, ratifying them. So technically, it can go ahead, do whatever it wants, and not involve provinces, provincial governments, and municipal governments. That's what the law says, right? And in some cases, they've done that. Except that the funny part is, if there is a dispute, according to that agreement, basically only the federal government is on the hook, right? I mean, you might remember when under NAFTA, the province of Newfoundland and Labrador kicked out BDB Bowater, right? They nationalized, they expropriated the company, and BDB Bowater sued the government of Canada for, I forget, $600 million or something like that. Then the Canadian government settled for $150 million. Did the federal government go after the provincial government to get the money back? No, it didn't. Because there is really no such mechanism within the federal system to do that unless you want to start taking away from transfer payments, which then becomes a whole new ballgame, right? I could just see how the federal government would say, oh, your health money, we're going to keep $150 million of it because of a trade dispute that your government did. And people will say, well, wait a minute, that's unfair. I'm not getting, the kind of treatment that I should get. So normally the feds take the hit. In a way, it's like you negotiated this deal, now you have to pay for it. So it creates an interesting dynamic in terms of federal politics, where you have the federal government, ultimately the only government responsible, but at the same time, more and more now they're bringing in issues that touch provincial and municipal governments. Now, because of that, you would think that municipal governments, provincial governments would be much more closely involved in the negotiations. They were with the European Union. They were actually, provincial representatives were at the negotiations, which in fact was quite funny, where you had, the European Union representing 28 countries, and there were more Canadians in the room than there were Europeans in the room, because they have a system where, the European Commission negotiates, but they really do a lot of consultations and all that, which in Canada, we have not really formally set up. So one of the recommendations that I made a while ago with a colleague was to try to adopt some kind of more formal system where municipalities, provincial governments would be able to not be there in the room, because that's probably is not physically feasible and probably not advisable, but at least have a more formal way of feeding into those negotiations. Because right now, in a way, municipalities are dependent on their provincial government representing their interest in those negotiations. And then even there, often the method that works right now, the system that is there is informal and mostly consultative. Like the federal government comes back and say, well, this is what we're thinking of doing. What do you think? Right? But it's very reactive in a way, right? And then they kind of take the information, they go back, and then they might somewhat change, and then maybe some province will say, no, you really have to do something on this, right? You have to protect us. And then who knows, right? Then it can be a compromise. We saw it when it came in terms of the question before about supply management with the Europeans, right? Canada, the federal government accepted to give more quotas to the Europeans for dairy, but in exchange it got, in a way, more quotas from the Europeans for pork and beef. Now, who was in power at the time, you can kind of figure out why that kind of compromise was made. Right? So ultimately, ideally we should have a more formal system for involving sub-national level governments like municipalities into the process, so that the information can be fed in. But I guess what I would say is just be more proactive. When there is a negotiation, work together, and I guess with AMO, which probably already feeds into those negotiations, but maybe not just through the provincial government. Maybe do like the Europeans. They deal directly with the feds in those cases. So maybe, I don't know how much of that is already done, but I would certainly encourage to do more, because ultimately it's your interest at stake.
One more.
All right, thank you. Greg Wilson, Mayor of Dryden. I might have missed it, I came in halfway, but a question I had was, what about interprovincial trade barriers just in our own country that would impact municipalities much more than I think this topic, although this does, and in particular to do with flow of labor. You know, we have problems with shortage of manpower, and we can't get workers from across the border in Manitoba to come this way without a lot of extra paperwork.
You're absolutely right. The situation is the same. I mean, I didn't talk about the Canada Free Trade Agreement that was signed last year. That is another step to remove interprovincial barriers to interprovincial trade, but a lot of them remain, actually. Most people who work on trade were very disappointed with the agreement, saying it doesn't go far enough, right? You have these kinds of barriers where workers can't cross, or even when I moved from Quebec to Ontario, so, my wife, who's from Europe, said, actually, it's worse than when she moved from Italy to the United Kingdom, right? I had to get a new driver's license and a new insurance and all these things, couldn't bring with me because I was moving provinces. It was like moving a country. And she couldn't understand it because basically she just shows up in another European country and everything is recognized and she can just work and buy a car and do all these things. Whereas here, you kind of have to do all this. So it's a nature of our system, but certainly at many levels, it could be made a lot easier. But again, it's always the problem with the politics of trade. You have these vested interests, and in some cases, because of, in certain trades, they don't want the competition, and they fear that if they open it up to other provinces, it's going to hurt them. Except that overall, yes, it creates opportunities. It can create also competition, but certainly for municipalities, in some cases, it might actually be a good thing. So, but there's no right or wrong answer. It's just that's the nature of the politics, unfortunately.
Well, Patrick, on behalf of everyone in attendance here this afternoon, a big thank you for taking your time and your presentation and giving us some enlightenment with regard to some of the challenging discussion that's taking place and has taken place and will continue to take place around international trade and how it affects municipalities.
It's not going away.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick and Rick. That was very helpful information. So now I am pleased to introduce Mike Schreiner, leader of the Green Party of Ontario and MPP for Guelph. Mike Schreiner was elected leader of the Green Party of Ontario in November 2009. He is the